August 7, 1944, Mortain, Normandy, France. Before sunrise, the roads and sunken lanes around the town were already crowded with movement. Engines idled under tree cover, tracks clinked against stone culverts, and dispatch riders carried last-minute instructions along a front that had been cracking since the American breakout at the end of July. The German counterattack had a code name, Operation Lüttich, but its purpose was immediate. Drive west from the Mortain area toward Avranches and the coast, cutting the American corridor in the process. On paper, it was an armored riposte built around familiar German strengths. Panzer divisions concentrated for a short operational bound, aimed at a decisive geographic hinge. In reality, Normandy imposed limits the map could not show. The bocage hedgerows turned fields into walled compartments, and the lanes between them became funnels. Armor and its supporting vehicles had to move in long, compressed columns. If the lead elements slowed at a junction, everything behind them stacked up. If a column was seen from the air, it could be fixed in place. German officers understood the danger. Allied air power had been shaping the campaign since D-Day, and by August 1944 it was not a rare event but a daylight condition. The Hawker Typhoon, pushed into a dedicated ground attack role, carried heavy cannon and rocket projectiles that could wreck soft-skin transport and, with direct hits, damage or destroy armored vehicles. Yet the most decisive effect was what repeated strikes did to time. A column halted for minutes became a column that could not regain its rhythm before the next strike arrived. That morning, the weather removed the last uncertainty. Skies over Normandy were clear enough for aircraft to operate in strength. Clear skies meant that any armored advance would be measured against a clock the Germans did not control, the time it took for a sighting report to become rockets on target. Near the front, Allied airfields were close enough that aircraft could cycle quickly, and air-ground communication had matured into a routine that turned movement into coordinates. As the German spearheads began to press out from the Mortain area, the attack still carried momentum on the ground. But the decisive question was already taking shape. Not how many tanks were committed, but how long any of them could keep moving once the first typhoons arrived and turned narrow Normandy roads into traps. At first light, the German lead elements tried to force speed out of terrain that punished it. The approach roads west of Mortain were narrow, bordered by hedgerows and shallow embankments that offered concealment only until a vehicle moved. To make time, armor stayed on the lanes. That decision created the very signature Allied air power was designed to exploit. Long columns, predictable routes, and choke points where a single disabled vehicle could lock the entire formation in place. The aircraft waiting for that signature was the Hawker Typhoon. Originally designed as a fighter, it had become, by 1944, one of the RAF's most feared tactical strike platforms in Northwest Europe. Typhoon squadrons operated in direct support of the ground battle and were equipped with rocket projectiles, typically 8 per aircraft, fired in salvo. In theory, a rocket could penetrate armored vehicles with a direct hit, but air-to-ground accuracy against moving tanks was never perfect. What made the Typhoon decisive at Mortain was not simply the number of catastrophic kills. It was the way repeated rocket and cannon attacks shattered the mechanics of an armored offensive. Movement, tempo, cohesion, and the ability to keep supply vehicles close enough to sustain the spearhead. The first strikes that morning produced the pattern that would repeat all day. Typhoons arrived fast, low enough for pilots to identify columns, and attacked in short, violent passes. Rockets impacted with heavy blast effect, cannon rounds stitched vehicles, and near misses threw dirt and shrapnel into engines and running gear. A tank did not have to burn to be out of the fight. A damaged track, a jammed turret ring, a wounded crew, or a stalled engine under air attack could turn a vehicle into a roadblock. Behind it, the column compressed. Drivers braked. Spacing collapsed. Orders became harder to pass. Men left vehicles for cover, then struggled to remount and reorganize under the threat of the next strike. This is where Mortain becomes a lesson in systems rather than individual weapons. German armor was not simply hit. It was fixed, disrupted, and repeatedly retargeted. Every forced halt cost minutes. Minutes became hours, and hours under clear skies belonged to the side that could keep aircraft cycling back to the same battlefield faster than the attacker could restore momentum. By midday on August 7th, the counterattack was no longer racing toward Avranches. It was struggling to move at all, while the machinery of Allied air-ground coordination began to turn sightings into strikes with relentless speed. The crucial advantage at Mortain was not simply that Allied aircraft appeared. It was that they appeared as part of an organized cycle, already refined by the summer of 1944 into a working system of detection, assignment, attack, and re-attack. Ultra-decrypts had given Allied commanders warning of a German counterstroke in the Mortain sector, and that meant air assets were not improvising. They were positioned to respond the moment German armor committed itself to movement in daylight. In the air, the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force brought rocket-firing Typhoons in concentrated waves, while American fighters helped keep German aircraft away from the battlefield. Once the morning haze lifted, the sky over Mortain was increasingly dominated by Allied fighter bombers. Contemporary summaries describe Typhoons flying hundreds of sorties that afternoon, firing thousands of rockets and dropping substantial bomb loads in repeated attacks on German formations trying to advance on exposed roads and open approaches east of Mortain. The importance of those numbers was not just destructive power. It was endurance. A single strike can be endured. A continuous series of strikes changes what is possible. On the ground, air support was no longer a vague promise from higher headquarters. It had become an integrated process. Forward observers and air liaison teams could report movement, request strikes, and update targets as the situation shifted. That created a brutal dilemma for any armored column. If it stayed on the road, it was visible. If it dispersed, it lost speed and coordination. If it tried to regroup, it presented a fresh target at the exact moment when the next aircraft were already cycling back in. The German counterattack required tempo to reach Avranches. But each forced halt drained tempo away, and the hedgerows ensured that dispersal often meant immobilization rather than protection. At the same time, the Mortain fighting exposed a point that British and Allied analysis would wrestle with after Normandy. Rockets and bombs did not always translate into tank kills at the rate pilots believed in the moment. Smoke, dust, and the chaos of a strike encouraged overclaiming, and later battlefield studies questioned how many tanks were actually destroyed from the air versus knocked out by ground fire. Yet, even when the exact number of burned-out panzers is debated, the operational effect is far clearer. Air attacks smashed the soft-skinned vehicles that kept armor supplied, forced crews to abandon or separate from vehicles, and, most importantly, made daylight movement an unacceptable risk. By early afternoon, the counterattack was being shaped less by German intent than by what Allied air power permitted, and the battle was moving toward a wider truth about Normandy. The decisive weapon was not a single rocket or a single tank, but the system that could strike again before the enemy could recover. By mid-afternoon on August 7th, the Mortain counterattack had reached the point where German commanders were no longer choosing between alternative routes to Avranches. They were choosing between continuing to move and preserving what remained of their armored strength. The original concept demanded a rapid, coordinated thrust. But in the Norman landscape, coordination depended on roads, and roads depended on daylight discipline, exactly what Allied air power punished most severely. Every time a column tried to reform after an attack, it created the telltale pattern of stationary vehicles and clustered movement that drew another strike. At the same time, the ground fight was tightening in ways that turned German problems into American opportunities. The German advance in the Mortain sector ran into hard defensive positions, particularly on the heights that overlooked the main approaches. On Hill 314, American infantry held through repeated assaults, and their ability to maintain observation over the battlefield mattered because it denied the Germans the concealment they needed to regain tempo. The battlefield around Mortain was not open steppe. It was a set of compartments, and the high ground acted like a control tower, directing attention to every attempted shift of armor and supply vehicles. The result was that German formations could not move freely even when they were not under direct attack. They were constantly being forced to plan around the next airstrike and the next defensive fire point, losing the initiative in increments. British and Allied operational records describe the day as one in which German armor suffered heavy losses under sustained air attack, and where the repeated strikes contributed to the failure to reach the objective. But the real damage, measured in operational terms, extended beyond tanks. Soft-skin transport, trucks, half-tracks, fuel vehicles, ammunition carriers, was far more vulnerable to rockets and cannon than armored vehicles, and once those were destroyed or scattered, armored movement became a short sprint with no breath behind it. A panzer formation that loses fuel and ammunition support does not merely slow down. It becomes an armored collection of isolated points, able to defend locally, but unable to continue an offensive that depends on distance and time. This is why the Typhoon rocket story at Mortain cannot be reduced to a single statistic about tank penetration. The rocket was the tool, but the target was the offensive system. If a tank was destroyed, it was removed. If a fuel truck was destroyed, a whole unit's future movement was removed. If a column halted repeatedly, the day's schedule collapsed. And in Normandy, once an offensive schedule collapsed, the counterattack was not delayed. It was defeated. By evening, German forward progress had stalled well short of the coastbound corridor it needed to cut, and the counterattack's promise had evaporated into a grim calculus. Daylight movement had become a liability, and without daylight movement, there was no path to Avranches. What happened next was predictable in outline and messy in detail. Pilots coming off target reported tanks destroyed, vehicles burning, columns smashed. From the air, a rocket impact threw up a violent bloom of smoke and dust that looked like a kill even when the armored vehicle underneath was only damaged, bailed out, or temporarily immobilized. Post-battle analysis repeatedly showed that rocket accuracy against a tank-sized target was limited, and that the gap between claims and confirmed tank kills could be wide. A British study cited in later summaries put the probability of a direct rocket hit from a typical salvo at only a few percent, which helps explain why dramatic pilot claims often did not match the wrecks found afterward. But Mortain was not decided by a scoreboard of burnt-out Panthers alone. It was decided by what air attack did to the structure of an armored offensive. Rocket-firing Typhoons could shred trucks, half-tracks, staff vehicles, fuel carriers, and ammunition lorries with far greater reliability than they could snipe tanks. When those support vehicles were destroyed or driven off the roads, Panzer units lost the ability to sustain forward movement even if many tanks were still technically operational. The offensive was strangled in its logistics, and once movement slowed, the battlefield became easier to manage from the Allied side. Stationary formations were easier to locate, easier to mark, and easier to strike again within the same afternoon cycle. The RAF's own analysis of rocket tactics emphasized mass salvo firing from a dive and repeated attacks, methods designed as much to suppress and disrupt as to score perfect single rocket hits. At Mortain, that disruption arrived at the exact moment the Germans could least afford it. Operation Lüttich depended on speed to the Avranches corridor, and speed depended on daylight movement. Yet ultra-intercepts meant Allied leaders anticipated the counterattack and arranged heavy tactical air support for the critical hours. Once the morning cleared, large numbers of Allied aircraft dominated the sky over the battlefield, and German armor operating in open ground became exposed to rocket-firing Typhoons and other fighter bombers in repeated waves. By evening on August 7th, the question was no longer whether German armor could break through to the coast. It was how much of the Panzer force could still be extracted intact before the wider Normandy battle snapped shut around it. The wider meaning of Mortain became clear in the days that followed. Operation Lüttich did not fail because German armor doctrine suddenly stopped working, or because the Panzer crews lacked experience. It failed because, by August 1944, Normandy belonged to a coalition that could see movement, assign aircraft, and deliver repeated strikes faster than an attacker could restore momentum. The Hawker Typhoon's rockets mattered, but they mattered most as part of that larger machine. Forward airfields close enough to keep sorties turning, communications good enough to turn sightings into coordinates, and air superiority strong enough to make the battlefield a one-way environment. British operational history treats Mortain as a key moment in the struggle to contain and then reverse the German counterattack while the Allied breakout continued to widen, and it sits directly on the timeline that leads into the closing of the Falaise pocket. In that sense, Mortain was not only a dramatic day of rockets and smoke. It was a confirmation that daylight armored movement in Northwest Europe had become a liability for Germany, and that the decisive advantage was no longer tactical brilliance but sustained capacity. The ability to keep pressure on hour after hour until the offensive system broke. If you want more World War II stories told with this level of detail and verified history, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from today.